April 18, 1942. Stark 20 hours. USS Hornet, North Pacific Ocean. The lookout's words snapped over the bridge phone. Surface contact bearing 020 degree. Range 12,000 Walurid. Lieutenant Commander Frank Akers lowered his binoculars and hit the ship's intercom. The Japanese picket boat Nito Mararu had unknowingly doomed 16 B-25 Mitchells secured to the carrier's wooden deck. None aboard realized that this accidental meeting would set in motion the first U.S. air raid on the Japanese home islands. An operation so bold its architects regarded it as near suicidal. The morning revealed towering seas smashing over Hornet's bow. Winds neared 40 knots. Rain reduced visibility to under 5 miles. These were not the weather conditions Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had practiced for at Eglin Field. The release point still lay 650 nautical miles from Japan, 250 miles farther than planned. The arithmetic was stark. Each B-25 now contained 1,141 gallons of fuel. Even at optimal cruise economy, they might only make the Chinese coast. Perhaps the Pearl Harbor attack had forced American strategists to accept a hard lesson. Isolation by distance no longer guaranteed safety. If Japanese carrier planes could strike Hawaii without warning, then Japan itself could be reached by American forces. The logic was clear. Hit the Japanese islands and break the aura of imperial invulnerability that had underwritten Japan's Pacific advance. President Franklin Roosevelt had demanded immediate reprisal after December 7, 1941. Not months later, not waiting until U.S. industry could flood the theater with overwhelming power. While bodies still floated in Pearl Harbor's oil-slicked waters, and Japanese columns advanced unchecked across the Philippines, Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, the American public needed proof their nation could hit back. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, grasped the strategic stakes. Japan's defensive ring ran from the Kuril Islands down to the Dutch East Indies, a line of fortified islands and bases that conventional assaults would take years to punch through. The Japanese home islands themselves sat behind that screen, shielded by distance, radar nets, and the belief that no American bomber could reach Tokyo from any extant base. Captain Francis Lowe, operations officer on King's staff, had watched Army Air Force's bombers practice carrier deck takeoffs at Naval Station Norfolk's Chambers Field on January 10, 1942. The runway had been marked like a carrier deck for landing drills. Twin engine. Bombers launching from carriers. The idea flouted every tenet of naval aviation, yet Lowe's sighting sparked a radical shift in strategic imagination. The USS Hornet displaced 19,800 tons standard and 25,500 tons when fully loaded. Her flight deck measured 809 feet long and 86 feet wide. 4 Parsons-geared steam turbines produced 120,000 shaft horsepower, pushing the carrier through Pacific swells at 32.5 knots. Captain Mark Andrew Mitcher commanded 2,219 officers and enlisted men. For this mission, however, the ship carried no Navy planes. Every square inch of deck held 16 U.S. Army Air Force's B-25B Mitchell medium bombers. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood 5 high and 4. But his standing in American aviation was immense. A doctorate from MIT in aeronautical engineering and winner of the Schneider, Thompson, and Bendix trophies. The first to perform an outside loop. The first to cross the continent in under 24 hours. The first to take off, fly, and land solely by instruments. At 45, Doolittle had accumulated more time in experimental ships than most pilots spent in a lifetime. The B-25B Mitchell symbolized American industrial ingenuity. Wingspan 67.7, length 53.6, empty weight 21,100 lb. 2 R260-13 Cyclone engines, each rated at 1,700 horsepower. Standard range 1,350 miles with a 3,000 lb bomb load. But standard meant little for this mission. North American Aviation's technicians performed surgical modifications on each plane. The lower gun turret was removed, saving 600 pounds and cutting the drag that consumed fuel. Extra fuel tanks were added in the bomb bay, crawlway, and lower turret area, boosting capacity from 646 gallons to 1,141 gallons. The standard Norden bomb sight was swapped for a 20-cent contrivance devised by Captain Charles Ross Greening and assembled from hardware store parts. The mission's logistics were merciless. A normal carrier takeoff required 500 feet of deck. The B-25s would have only 467 feet between their start positions and the bow. Wind over the deck had to top 40 knots to create enough lift. Each bomber's loaded weight was 31,000 lbd, almost double the Navy's largest carrier plane. No Army bomber had ever launched from a carrier in combat. No medium bomber had ever been tasked with a 2,400-mile over-water flight without fighter cover. In April 1942, Japan's home defense reflected 3 years of meticulous planning and deep confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet dominated the Western Pacific, from the Aleutians to Australia. Land-based airfields provided overlapping patrols from island chains. Submarine picket lines watched approaches to the home islands. But the supposed first line of defense was simpler and thought infallible. A fleet of picket boats, converted fishing vessels, posted roughly every 50 miles out to 600-700 miles from the coast. Each boat carried radio gear able to report sightings back to naval headquarters in Tokyo. The Nito Mararu, nominally listed at 70 tons, was in truth a pressed fishing boat with 11 crewmen and a single machine gun for protection. Its job was straightforward: spot American ships and radio their location before it was sunk. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the first air fleet that struck Pearl Harbor, insisted American carriers could not approach within 600 miles of Japan undetected. His 6 fleet carriers had shown at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and elsewhere that carrier aviation had become the decisive weapon at sea. The closest U.S. bases able to launch heavy bombers were in the Aleutians, over 2,000 miles from Tokyo. B-17 flying fortresses based in Australia were about 3,000 miles away. Fuel consumption math and bomb loads made any traditional bombing raid impossible. General Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister and War Minister, had reassured Emperor Hirohito that the divine winds which once saved Japan from Mongols would shield the homeland from American attack. The Japanese populace had been told their islands were encircled by an impenetrable defensive barrier. Enemy aircraft would never darken Japanese skies, a conviction that made the raid's psychological blow far more damaging than its physical effects. At 0310 on April 18th, the radar operator aboard USS Enterprise reported a surface contact bearing Orontuekdig at 21,000 yards, tracking southwest at 9 knots across Task Force 16's planned route. Admiral William F. Halsey, commanding from Enterprise, faced an immediate choice: press on toward the launch point and risk being spotted, or launch at once from beyond the ideal range. The picket boat Nito Maru had sighted the American force at 0530. Seaman First Class Nakamura sent the contact report. 3 enemy carriers sighted. Position 650. Nautical miles east of Inubosaki. Course west, speed 20 knots. Atmospheric static garbled parts of the message, but Tokyo received enough to sound an alert. USS Nashville opened fire at 0538. Her 6-inch guns bracketed the picket with the second salvo. Nito Maru burned and sank within minutes, but her warning had already gone through. Halsey made the only viable call: launch immediately or cancel. At 0620 he signaled Hornet, launch planes. To Doolittle and his men he radioed, good luck and God bless you. Doolittle's B-25, tail number 40-2344, sat 406 feet from the bow. Navy Launch Officer Lieutenant Henry Miller stood on the port side, timing the carrier's pitch amid 30-foot swells. As Hornet's bow dropped into a trough, Miller waved his checkered flag, the cue to advance throttles to full. Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard watched cylinder head temperatures climb toward the red. Co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole called airspeed as the bomber raced down the spray-swept deck. 40 knots, 50, 60. The white deck edge line rushed up beneath them. At 0820, with fewer than 50 feet of deck left, Doolittle eased back on the control yoke. The B-25 lurched into the air, dipped toward the sea as it lost the extra lift from the carrier's bow wind, then slowly rose into the gray Pacific morning. 15 more bombers followed at roughly 4-minute intervals. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's plane cleared the deck with 10 feet to spare. Lieutenant Robert Gaze climbed so low after launch that prop wash soaked the tail gunner's station. Captain David Jones watched green water break over his windscreen before achieving positive climb. Each pilot performed an aviation miracle, sending overloaded medium bombers off a pitching carrier into gale-strength winds. The 16 B-25s flew singly toward Japan under strict radio silence, skimming wave tops to evade radar. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, magnetic compass, and drift meter. No radio beacons, no weather updates, no fighter escort. Each 5-man crew was alone over some 650 miles of hostile ocean. Doolittle's aircraft reached the Japanese coast at 12:30 local time. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter placed them within 5 miles, despite rain squalls and shifting winds. Civilians in fishing boats waved, apparently mistaking the low-flying bomber for a Japanese patrol plane. The dummy gun barrels in the tail cones had fooled them. Tokyo's air raid warnings, sounded at Aero 900 after the Nitomaru report, had been cancelled at noon when nothing materialized. The city's 6.5 million residents were carrying out ordinary Saturday routines when Doolittle's bombardier, Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, opened the bomb bay at 13:15. 4 500-pound incendiary clusters fell from 1,200 feet, spreading fires across 10 city blocks in the Chita district. 30 seconds later, Lieutenant Travis Hoover hit the Tokyo Special Steel Company complex. The powder works erupted in a column of flame visible miles away. Lieutenant Robert Gray struck the Tokyo Gas and Electric Engineering Works. Lieutenant Everett Holstrom hit the Agura Oil Refinery. Captain David Jones bombed military warehouses in Yokohama. Crews followed assigned target folders, but weather, navigation drift, and flak forced rapid in-flight decisions. A second wave reached Japan between 13 and 14, or Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, flying the Green Hornet, struck Yokohama's steel mills under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Ted Lawson bombed the Nippon Machinery Works. Lieutenant Harold Watson attacked the Tokyo Naval Arsenal. Lieutenant Richard Joyce hit the Japan Special Steel Company. Crews reported successful runs, though they could not assess damage while sprinting for the Chinese coast. Captain Edward York suffered a left-engine fuel leak 200 miles from Japan, and unable to reach China, turned northwest and landed at Vladivostok after a 6-hour flight. His crew spent 14 months in Soviet internment. Moscow publicly denied them but privately treated them as guests. Lieutenant William Farrow's bomber reached Nagoya as fighters scrambled from Kasumigara Naval Air Station. 9 Mitsubishi A6M-0s chased Farrow's B-25, but its low altitude and top speed foiled interceptions. Corporal Jacob Diasa released 4 incendiary clusters over the Mitsubishi plant, destroying the paint shop and damaging assembly buildings. With each explosion, the psychological effect multiplied. Tokyo had not heard air raid sirens since the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Children fled schools. Office workers poured into the streets. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was inspecting military bases during the raid, and watched a B-25 pass close enough to see the pilot, though the aircraft never fired on him. The raid had ruptured the myth of Japanese invulnerability. As the B-25s turned for China, fuel gauges fell faster than planned. Headwinds above 25 knots pushed consumption beyond worst-case estimates. The Chinese airfield at Chuchao, expected to guide incoming planes with homing beacons and runway lights, was dark and silent, and radio calls went unanswered. Crews faced a terrible choice: bail out over unknown territory or attempt night water landings. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's B-25 struck the sea at 110 Netlap in a ditching attempt that split the aircraft in two, hurling Lawson through the windscreen. He suffered a compound fracture of the left leg, severe facial lacerations, and multiple broken teeth. Navigator Lieutenant Charles McClure pulled the unconscious pilot from the sinking fuselage, while gunner David Thatcher repeatedly swam into the wreck to retrieve equipment and medical supplies. The Chinese military had not been notified of the operation because of tight security and breakdowns in communication, so General Chiang Kai-shek only learned of the raid when bombers began crossing into Chinese airspace. Chinese ground units, mistaking the B-25s for Japanese aircraft, opened fire with anti-aircraft weapons, and Lieutenant Donald Smith's bomber took hits near Nanchang, forcing his crew to bail out over territory held by the Japanese. After dark, the weather over China worsened dramatically. Cloud bases fell to about 500 feet, visibility dropped below a mile, and mountain peaks along the route rose to some 6,000 feet. So without beacons or accurate charts, crews were left to rely on instinct and luck. And fuel starvation became unavoidable as gauges went to empty between roughly 2,200 and 2,400 hours. Lieutenant Harold Watson ordered his men to jump at 11,000 feet when both engines quit from fuel exhaustion. The 5 of them came down across 20 miles of mountainous Jiang province, and Watson's chute snagged in a tree, leaving him suspended 30 feet above the ground in freezing rain until Chinese farmers heard his calls and cut him loose after 6 hours. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew provided one of the mission's final trials. After striking Yokohama, Hallmark headed west into night. Navigator Lieutenant Chase Nielsen thought they had crossed the Chinese coast, but no airfields appeared. Fuel gauges were empty and both engines were sputtering on vapor. So at 23:45 hours, Hallmark ordered preparations for a controlled crash landing. The B-25 hit the water near the Chinese shore with tremendous force, slamming Hallmark into the instrument panel and inflicting severe head trauma, rendering co-pilot Lieutenant Robert M. Ma unconscious, while Bombardier Staff Sergeant William Dieter and Engineer Corporal Donald Fitzmaurice drowned as the aircraft sank. And Nielsen escaped through a shattered canopy to pull Hallmark and Ma to safety. Lieutenant William Farrow's crew suffered a comparable fate. After bombing Nagoya, they ran out of fuel over China and bailed into total darkness from 8,000 feet. Bombardier Corporal Jacob Disa fell into a fertilized rice paddy. Coated in human waste, lost and unable to speak Chinese, wandered for hours, and was eventually discovered by a Japanese patrol, after which he endured 40 months in solitary confinement and repeated torture for information about American carriers. Farrow and Navigator Lieutenant George Barr were captured within hours. Engineer Sergeant Harold Spatz was beaten unconscious by Japanese troops who found him hiding in a Buddhist temple, and co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Hite was seized while asking Chinese villagers, who had been threatened with execution if they helped Americans, for assistance. The Japanese response was immediate and ruthless. Emperor Hirohito personally ordered that captured airmen be treated as war criminals and executed because the raiders had not worn standard military uniforms during the attack, technically exposing them to charges of espionage under international law. 8 captured raiders faced sham trials in Shanghai. Lieutenants Farrow and Hallmark and Sergeant Spatz were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942, while 5 others received life sentences. In all, 69 of the 80 Doolittle raiders eventually reached safety in free China. 3 died in crashes or drowned. 8 were captured by Japanese forces, and 1 crew was interned in the Soviet Union. Every B-25 was lost, either crashed, sunk, or abandoned to prevent capture, and the physical damage inflicted on Japan was limited. Some 50 killed, 252 wounded, and roughly 112 buildings destroyed or damaged. Standing in a Chinese rice field beside his downed bomber, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle declared he expected court-martial for losing the entire force. "I've lost all 16 planes," he told his men. But his flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard, replied, "Colonel, you've just won the Medal of Honor." The raid's strategic consequences, however, dwarfed its material payoff. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, learned of the strike while eating breakfast. After 30 minutes of silence, he issued orders that set in motion a campaign to destroy the American carriers that had embarrassed the Japanese Navy, approving the Midway operation immediately despite earlier naval staff doubts. President Roosevelt announced the mission to the American people with deliberate misdirection. When asked where the planes had taken off, he smiled and said, "Shangri-La," borrowing the name of James Hilton's fictional Himalayan haven, and the nation, hungry for good news after months of setbacks, celebrated the first direct strike on the Japanese homeland, pushing war bond sales up about 20% the following week. The raid's ripple effects were significant. 4 Imperial Army fighter groups were recalled from the Southwest Pacific to bolster homeland defenses, depriving fronts in New Guinea and the Solomons of badly needed air units, and contributing to Allied successes at Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. The Navy accelerated its Midway timetable by 6 weeks, shortening planning time and undermining coordination, and the Chinese paid a horrific price when Japanese forces launched Operation Seago, a retaliatory sweep through Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces, in which General Shunroku Hata ordered some 100,000 troops to root out and annihilate anyone thought to have aided the Americans, burning villages, contaminating wells with cholera and typhoid, and causing an estimated 250,000 civilian deaths in a 3-month campaign of systematic brutality. Technologically and doctrinally, the raid also changed Allied air tactics. The effectiveness of low-level attacks spurred the development of skip bombing against shipping, and the B-25's field performance encouraged conversion into heavily armed strafing variants that served across the Pacific, with North American aviation producing G and H models fitted with a 75mm cannon in the nose that turned medium bombers into potent flying artillery. Yamamoto's fixation on destroying the American carrier threat culminated in the Battle of Midway beginning on June 4, 1942, when Japanese planners committed 4 fleet carriers to the operation. American codebreakers, reading Japanese naval signals, positioned 3 U.S. carriers for an ambush, and dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown fatally struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, while the 4th carrier, Hiryu, was sunk hours later. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their seasoned aircrews at Midway inflicted damage Japan never fully repaired. Hulls could be rebuilt, but the veteran pilots could not be replaced, and years of training and combat expertise were swept away beneath the waves, permanently tilting carrier air superiority toward the United States, a reversal that traced its lineage back to 16 B-25s launched from USS Hornet on a stormy April morning. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt at the White House on May 19, 1942, and was promoted straight to Brigadier General, skipping Colonel. He would later command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th in the Mediterranean, and the 8th Air Force in England. Every participant in the raid earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Chinese government awarded the raiders the Order of the Cloud and Banner. The human toll echoed for decades. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's memoir 30 Seconds Over Tokyo became a bestseller and a Hollywood film. Corporal Jacob de Chazer, after 40 months of captivity, returned to Asia as a missionary and ultimately converted a former jailer, and Lieutenant Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, lived to be 103, dying in 2019 as the last surviving raider. The technical fixes that made the operation possible hardened into doctrine. Carrier aviation shifted from purely fleet defense to long-range power projection. Joint Army-Navy operations that seemed revolutionary in 1942 became standard practice, and special missions demanding extreme range and minimal support traced their pedigree to 16 bombers launched into an ostensibly impossible mission. Japanese historians would later call the raid the Pacific War's psychological pivot. Not Pearl Harbor, which had fed Japanese hubris, nor Midway 2 months later, but the day American bombers crossed Tokyo's skies and proved that sea barriers once thought sacrosanct meant little against carrier air. The executions of captured raiders lingered in Japanese command memory. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, grievously wounded, walked to his death with dignity. And at 4:30 p.m. on October 15, 1942, outside Shanghai, Hallmark, William Farrow, and Harold Spatz, were tied to small crosses, blindfolded, given a moment for prayer, and then shot. Their bodies were cremated, an ultimate indignity in the eyes of their captors. Co-pilot Robert M. Ma, who survived the crash, died in captivity on December 1, 1943, of malnutrition and dysentery. Surviving prisoners, Nielsen, Haidt, Barr and de Chazer among them, endured years of torture, starvation, and solitary confinement until liberation in August 1945, their survival owed to mutual support, a smuggled Bible, and sheer resolve. The operational statistics remain staggering. 16 bombers, each weighing some 31,000 pounds, launched from a carrier deck in 40-knot winds and 30-foot seas, flew roughly 650 miles to unfamiliar targets using only compass and instinct, dropped about 64,000 pounds of ordnance across 5 Japanese cities in daylight, then attempted another 1,500-mile flight to dark, unknown landing sites. The Hornet herself survived only 6 more months, sunk at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942, taking 140 aircraft and 111 crewmen to the bottom. Yet her legacy was sealed on April 18, when 16 Army bombers accomplished what Japanese planners had called impossible. The raid demonstrated that innovation could offset inferior numbers, that bravery could substitute for material advantage, and that a small force could alter the strategic balance of the globe's largest war. The Japanese discovered their home islands were vulnerable, and the Americans discovered they could win. Those lessons shaped the bloody advance across the Pacific toward Tokyo Bay and unconditional surrender. In the National Museum of the United States Air Force Archives, a mangled aluminum fragment stamped 40-2267, the only remnant of Lieutenant Edgar M. Murroy's B-25 recovered from a Chinese mountainside in 1962, bears impact scars and decades of weathering. But forensic tests found traces of Tokyo factory smoke embedded in the metal, molecular proof that heavy bombers could be launched from carriers and redirect history. The final testament came from an unlikely voice. In 1959, Prince Norihito Takamatsu, Emperor Hirohito's brother, attended a Doolittle Raiders reunion in Tucson, Arizona, and when asked why he had come, replied, "Your 16 planes changed our world." He explained that the explosives dropped on Tokyo were small, but the ideas they carried were devastating. Courage and invention had overcome tradition and expectation. Every modern carrier aircraft launching from U.S. decks carries the heritage of April 18, 1942, and every joint service operation builds on the precedent set when Army Air Forces and Navy personnel ignored service boundaries to preserve the nation. The raid did not single-handedly win the Pacific War, but it proved the war could be won. Those 16 B-25 Mitchells bore more than bombs and fuel. They embodied a nation's concentrated will, the promise that distance offered no refuge from American retaliation, and the origins of carrier aviation's future, special operations, and combined force cooperation. Most importantly, they showed that in modern warfare the impossible is often only a very hard problem, and that